In the Epstein files, over 3 million documents describing horrible things, describing unspeakable things, much of it redacted. Over 24 people have resigned, CEOs, members of government worldwide. But I haven't seen any arrests or investigations here in the United States from this Department of Justice. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, who has since been stripped of his royal titles due to his affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein, has been arrested.
You ever watch a politician walk to the microphone and think, okay, this will be the usual talking points, and then suddenly they start naming names, accusing the system itself of being compromised, and suggesting powerful interests are steering justice from behind the curtain? That's exactly the moment that unfolded when Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massie stood on the House floor and said something most elected officials never say out loud, that the federal government, across all three branches, is being pressured by powerful lobbyists, and that the Department of Justice is failing to deliver accountability in the aftermath of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Here's where things get interesting. Massie wasn't speaking as an outsider throwing rocks. He was speaking as someone who helped write the law meant to force transparency around the Epstein investigation. And now, he's accusing the very system he worked through of not following that law.
Congress funds the Department of Justice, and Congress is responsible for the oversight of the Department of Justice. When will we see justice? I'll tell you what I've not seen. I've not seen any arrests from the revelations in the Epstein files, over 3 million documents describing horrible things, describing unspeakable things, much of it redacted. Over 24 people have resigned, CEOs, members of government worldwide. But I haven't seen any arrests or investigations here in the United States from this Department of Justice. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, who has since been stripped of his royal titles due to his affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein, has been arrested. Peter Mandelson, who previously served as UK's ambassador to the United States, resigned in disgrace from United Kingdom's House of Lords and the Labour Party, and he's been arrested. Former Prime Minister of Norway, Torbjorn Jagland, has been charged. But we don't see any charges, arrests, or investigations in the United States. What do we see? We see our FBI director celebrating in the locker room at the Olympics overseas. It's fine to be proud of this country, but we should be proud of this country because we have a system of justice that works. And yet we do not. Who are the men that should be investigated? I'll name them right here. Leon Black. You don't even have to see past the redactions to see that this man needs to be investigated. Jess Staley, accused of terrible things. It's right there in the files. Why is he not being investigated? And Leslie Wexner. Why did the FBI list him as a co-conspirator in their own documents in a child sex trafficking case, and then tell him, according to him, that they had no questions for him? Why is that? Well, the Epstein Files Transparency Act requires the DOJ and the FBI to disclose to us their internal memos and emails about how they made those decisions, whether to prosecute or not prosecute. Yet they have not delivered those memos. And we still don't have the memos and documents and emails from 2008 to explain why Jeffrey Epstein was given such a light sentence in what would have been an open and shut case of child sex trafficking, which allowed him to go back and recommit these terrible crimes, create hundreds of more victims, and ensnare so many other people in his conspiracy. Where are those documents that describe those decisions? We need justice. We want the Department of Justice to get to work, and that's what they need to do now. Madam Speaker, I rise today to let the American people know that this government is under siege. All three branches of this government is under siege by lobbyists and lawyers from a German company named Bayer. They spent over $9 million lobbying the executive branch and the legislative branch so that they don't have to be liable for any damages that their herbicide causes, otherwise known as Roundup. And they're having some success. Now, they haven't had any success yet in this chamber to get that immunity. They've had some success in the state legislatures, which are also under siege, to get this immunity from liability. Look, the Constitution guarantees people a trial if they've been harmed. Why are we contemplating going against the Constitution? The Attorney General has opined favorably for this German company in front of the Supreme Court about getting rid of any liability that they should have for any damages. And the most recent thing that we've seen, the executive branch. By the way, the President's Chief of Staff and the President's Attorney General work for one of the biggest lobbying firms that's received hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars from Bayer. And maybe that's why we've seen an executive order that says that the production of this chemical from this German company is a national defense priority. And we know why they're doing that. It's to keep them from having any liability. Everybody in this country deserves their day in court. This is wrong. We shouldn't succumb to the lobbyists, not in the executive branch, not in the judicial branch, and certainly not here in Congress and not in the state legislatures. But there's a lot of money at play. And I implore my colleagues to resist it and do not give them immunity.
To understand why this moment is getting attention, you need the backstory. A bipartisan bill known as the Epstein Files Transparency Act passed the House by a staggering 427 to 1 vote. That kind of margin almost never happens in modern Washington. The goal was simple: require the Department of Justice to release documents related to the Epstein case without redacting information merely to protect powerful or well-connected individuals from embarrassment. Massie helped push the measure forward alongside Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna. President Donald Trump signed it into law. On paper, it looked like a rare moment of bipartisan unity around accountability. But according to Massie, the reality has fallen short. He took the floor and said the American public has seen millions of documents, many heavily redacted, yet little visible action from federal prosecutors. He pointed out that high-profile figures overseas faced consequences or investigations connected to Epstein's network, while in the United States, accountability appears limited. He specifically mentioned individuals such as financier Leon Black, former Barclays executive Jess Staley, and retail magnate Leslie Wexner as figures whose connections have drawn scrutiny in civil proceedings or media investigations. Here's the part most people misunderstand. Naming someone in documents or lawsuits is not the same as proving criminal wrongdoing. But Massie's argument is that when names appear repeatedly in investigative records, the public deserves to understand why prosecutors did, or did not, pursue further action. He also questioned why internal DOJ memos explaining key prosecutorial decisions from earlier Epstein investigations have not been released, including documents tied to Epstein's controversial 2008 plea deal, a deal critics say allowed him to avoid harsher punishment and continue abusing victims. And that's where the tension really comes from. The law Congress passed was meant to prevent redactions used to shield reputations. Yet Massie and Khanna later reviewed files in a DOJ reading room and publicly stated that names still appeared to be withheld. When Massie pressed Attorney General Pam Bondi during a House Judiciary hearing, the exchange reportedly turned heated. In political Washington, that kind of clash signals more than disagreement. It signals a breakdown in trust between Congress and the agencies it oversees. But Massie didn't stop with the Epstein files. Now here's the twist. In the same speech, he pivoted to an entirely different controversy: lobbying influence tied to German pharmaceutical and chemical giant Bayer AG, the company that acquired Monsanto and now produces the herbicide Roundup. Massie argued that lobbyists representing Bayer are working to limit the company's legal liability in lawsuits related to glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. Thousands of plaintiffs in the U.S. claimed the product contributed to serious health issues, while regulators and scientific bodies continue to debate the chemical's safety. This is where the constitutional argument enters. Massie warned that proposals limiting lawsuits could undermine Americans' right to seek damages in court, a principle deeply embedded in U.S. civil law. He also criticized state-level legislative efforts and federal legal arguments that could preempt lawsuits if a product label is federally approved. Here's why that matters. If federal approval alone shields companies from liability, critics argue injured individuals could lose their ability to challenge products in court. Supporters of preemption counter that uniform federal standards prevent conflicting state rulings and protect supply chains critical to agriculture. And this is where the political optics become complicated. Public lobbying disclosures show Bayer spends millions annually advocating its interests in Washington. That alone is not unusual. Major corporations across industries lobby the federal government. But watchdog groups and commentators have pointed out connections between lobbying firms working for Bayer and figures who later assumed government roles. Critics argue such relationships create perceived conflicts of interest. Defenders say lobbying experience often translates into policy expertise. The debate intensified after the Trump administration designated glyphosate production a priority under national defense authorities, a move framed by supporters as ensuring agricultural stability and supply chain resilience. Critics questioned whether a farm chemical should qualify for such prioritization. Supporters responded that modern food security relies heavily on crop protection tools. This is where people start arguing. On one side, environmental advocates and health activists believe glyphosate exposure poses long-term risks and say litigation remains a crucial accountability tool. On the other side, agricultural groups warn that restricting glyphosate could increase food costs, reduce crop yields, and disrupt farming systems that feed millions. And layered on top of that policy fight is the broader political question Massie raised: whether lobbying pressure is shaping legal outcomes and government priorities. From the reactions I've seen online, people aren't reacting along traditional party lines. Some conservatives praise Massie for challenging corporate influence. Some progressives welcome scrutiny of pesticide policy and transparency failures. Others argue his claims overstate the evidence and risk undermining trust in institutions. That cross-ideological reaction tells you something important. Distrust of concentrated power, whether governmental or corporate, resonates across the political spectrum. There's also a deeper tension underneath all this. Americans generally believe two principles should hold true. Powerful individuals should face accountability under the law, and ordinary citizens should be able to seek justice if harmed. Massie's speech tapped directly into both concerns. He framed the Epstein files issue as a question of whether elites receive protection. He framed the Roundup litigation fight as a question of whether corporations can be shielded from legal consequences. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, the political strategy is clear. He is connecting transparency, accountability, and corporate influence into a single narrative about fairness. And that narrative resonates because it speaks to a broader erosion of public trust. Congress created the Department of Justice. Congress funds it. Congress oversees it. When members of Congress publicly question its actions, it signals tension between oversight and enforcement that rarely plays out so openly. Massie has suggested he may use his constitutional privilege as a member of Congress to disclose information on the House floor if transparency requirements are not met. That privilege, rooted in the speech or debate clause, protects lawmakers from legal repercussions for statements made during official proceedings. It's a dramatic step, and historically rare, which shows how high the stakes have become in the transparency fight. The surprising part is that this moment isn't purely partisan. A Republican congressman and a Democratic congressman co-wrote the transparency law. Both have raised concerns about redactions. Both have called for greater disclosure. That doesn't happen often, and when it does, it usually signals a deeper institutional issue rather than a political talking point. So where does this leave things? The Epstein files debate continues, with calls for fuller disclosure and explanations of prosecutorial decisions. The Supreme Court is poised to hear arguments related to Roundup liability and federal preemption, a ruling that could shape product liability law nationwide. Lobbying influence remains under scrutiny from watchdog groups and advocacy organizations, and public trust in institutions continues to be tested by moments like this. In my view, what made Massie's speech stand out wasn't just the allegations. It was the broader question underneath them. Who is the system ultimately accountable to? That's a question Americans across the political spectrum are still trying to answer. And this story isn't over yet. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.